In today's episode of Locked On Pistons podcast, there's been a lot of talk about who will the Pistons select at 5, but I want to talk about, is there any possible stretch 5 options in this draft, whether it's at 5 or later on in the first round that the Pistons should take a chance on? We'll talk about all that in today's episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast.
You are Locked On Pistons, your daily Detroit Pistons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's the deal? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast. Per usual, I'm your host, Kuka Hill. You can find me over on Twitter at Kuka Hill. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. And today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest, most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. You'll hear more about Prize Picks a little bit later. We are joined by our friend of the podcast, Hal. Comes on every summer, talk about the draft with us. For those of you guys watching on YouTube, I do want to say, I don't know what's going on with my camera. My audio is completely fine, but my camera, like every now and then, just like freezes for like 2 seconds and then comes back. So I apologize for that. I don't know what's going on, but it is what it is. We'll work with it. But Hal, thank you for coming on, man. How you doing?
Oh, I'm good. I'm ready to get this draft over with. It's coming up quick, so we're in crunch time now.
No, I'm ready for this whole offseason to get like finished. Yeah. The draft, the indecision on what's going on with Monty. I want this whole thing to just get just hurry up and over with. This is too much for me. But so one of the main things, or the main thing we're going to talk about on today's episode is something that I floated out. I've been talking about it a little bit since, I think around February, or when the Pistons acquired Mike Muscala and Gallinari. And it's the idea of, If Cade and Ausar, which is what it seems like to me, maybe Trajan feels completely differently, continue to throw that out there, but what it seems like to me is that Cade and Ausar are the Pistons' cornerstones, or those are the two guys they are the most high on right now, or they really think highly of. Doesn't mean they don't think highly of Ivy or Duran, but it just seems like to me, from what I understand, that those two guys are really their guys. If that's how you want to build, or you're really building the team around, is a stretch 5 the best option then to have next to Ausar? Or can you get away with having two non-shooters on the floor? So I've really floated the idea of potentially looking at a stretch 5, whether it's in the trade market, free agency, or the draft, whether that's something the Pistons really should be considering if they really like Ausar Thompson, like it sounds like. Obviously, they drafted him, so they have to like him a lot. But, you get what I'm saying. So I had Hal on to come on, and we're going to talk about 3 guys. And at the end of the podcast, I know a lot of you guys are going to want to hear about Donovan Clingan. So we'll touch on Donovan Clingan a little bit at the very end. But there's 3 names we're going to go through on this podcast of guys that could potentially be stretch 5s and whether the Pistons should be interested in them. So, Hal, I'm going to turn to you. The first guy that you brought up to me was Kel'el Ware. So tell me a little bit about Ware. Is he a viable option for the Pistons? What's he like? Tell me a little bit about him.
So Ware is probably the riskiest name we're going to bring up in terms of the reaction to him. Because he had a rough season last year, transfers to Indiana, and has a much better season this year. He's huge. He's over 7 foot. He has the wingspan. He is a true freak who has a little bit of ability to do just about everything. He's got a jumper. Didn't shoot a lot of them, but it's there, and he shoots like an actual jump shot. He's the rare big man who has leg sway and everything. He shoots a real jump shot. And one of the things that he was criticized for last year that he improved on is he can really bang in the post and get a little physical. And he's big. He got a lot better this year at drawing fouls and kind of actually mashing people. And then, of course, he just has a lot of tools defensively. He is, for his size, a freak athlete. I mean, he moves really well. The thing with Ware is you're going to end up with a lot of kind of James Wiseman-y comparisons where it's this is a dude who's really talented, but something hasn't 100% clicked for him yet. So, is this a guy where it's going to turn out that things just don't work and, maybe all this talent kind of goes to waste? Or is this, is this a guy who could end up being a legit starter with, all sorts of tools, it's really going to depend on your coaching, your player development, and just how much from a I don't want to cast aspersions on anyone's character, but how much he's willing to put in the work and willing to change some of the bad habits and everything. But one of the more fascinating players and also one of the more controversial players in this draft.
So, what are some of those negatives? What are some of the, the things that aren't clicking, the things that you expect to see click, but it's not clicking, that brings, concern to possibly drafting? What are those things?
He was accused of a lot of motor issues last year, especially, and I think that's an area he got a lot better on. And there were definitely issues where he wasn't yet recognizing the play, and so he was reacting late to a lot of things, which always for a lot of people blends into motor issues, right? Is it a motor? Is it just not processing things? And that was another thing that he took a step forward in this year, but is still not there. And then it's just like he has promise as a shooter. Does he fall in love with the jump shot and ruin the fact that he's big? Right? There's a little bit of a Kristaps Porzingis thing here, right? Where the power of having a Kristaps is that yes, he can shoot, but also the minute he switches onto a small player, right, he goes down and mauls them in the post, and it's an immediate high efficiency bucket. That's what you're hoping you get out of a guy like Kel'el Ware is someone who just gives you an option for every pick and roll coverage. Whether it's the jumper, whether it's the post mismatch. And it's just about decision making. It really all comes down to decision making and how quick he's thinking, and whether he can translate all this talent into production.
So, what's your eval on him defensively?
He's all right. I mean, I have such low expectations of young big men, um, especially big men when they're like true drop bigs. And Kel'el Ware can move in space, but this is a drop big man for sure. And it's very rare to have like an Evan Mobley who just comes in and gets it. So he's got a lot of talent. He can get off the floor very quickly. There's a lot of potential. I think his defensive tape this year is probably a little better than Jalen Duren's was as a college player, but his tape last year probably was about Duren's level. So he's made a little bit of strides, but he's not coming in as a guy who is we'll talk about Clingan later, and Clingan's like very good at understanding space and timing and all that stuff. Ware's still got a ways to go, which is why he's not even with all the tools, he's not really projected to be like a top 5 guy.
So offensively, obviously, we talk about the ability as a stretch 5. So first,
Yep.
do you believe that he enters the league immediately as someone who can space the floor for you, or is it more of a, because again, I haven't really watched any of these guys. I've been busy as ever, so I haven't really been able to get into any of these guys like I want to. But where is he someone who is entering immediately as a guy that's going to be able to shoot, or is it more of a projection based off of low volume, touch, stuff like that? Is it something like that, or is he entering immediately as someone you expect to space the floor?
I think he's going to enter immediately as someone who's going to be allowed to try to space the floor. He only shot he shot 43% on threes this year, right? So he shot a very efficient thing. It's a very low volume, like 1.5 attempts per game volume, right? So very, very low volume. I think a coach is going to say, hey, if you're wide open on a pick and pop, right? If that's what they're giving you, try a couple. This isn't going to be a guy who's going to be allowed to shoot through a cold streak, though, right? If he tries to take 6 in a game and he's only made 1, somebody's going to get mad at him. So, I expect him to be allowed to take some attempts. I expect him to come in probably more efficient than what Isaiah Stewart came in as, but I don't think I'm expecting him to come in shooting, 37% on 5 threes a game either.
So outside of that, are there any other tools offensively that you really like? Is he a good finisher on the rim? Is he a lob threat? What are some other things that you think Pistons fans could like about him offensively outside of the potential as an outside shooter?
Yeah, he's really athletic, so there should be plenty of lob threat, transition trailing kind of threat, offensive rebounds, that kind of stuff, garbage man collection. He should be able to do all that stuff. And then he is pretty good with both hands as a finisher in the post and stuff. Like if you put a point guard on him, I expect Kel'el to finish. So, yeah, it's really just about the decision making. What does he do when the doubles come, that kind of thing, more than can he just beat one person. I'm pretty confident he can do that for anyone but real brutes down low.
All right, and to wrap it up with Kel'el, and then we'll move on to other players. The Pistons have the 5th overall pick. So how multiple questions here. One, should he be in consideration for 5 for the Pistons?
No.
2, okay, well, let's move on. Let's move on to number 2. Why is he not considered one of these top? Why is he not? Why do you believe he should not be in consideration for 5? And since he's not in consideration for 5, where do you think that he would be an acceptable pick for the Pistons, assuming they trade back? Are you assuming that they potentially could trade back for him, or is this someone you're expecting them maybe to trade back into the first round or not? When I say that, not like back, like move backwards, but like to make another pick in the first round. Why isn't he one of the guys you think could be in consideration for 5? And what's the situation where you see him potentially being picked by the Pistons?
He's not in consideration for me at 5 because the consistency just isn't there, right? When you're picking that high, especially for a center, right? The replacement level center is like some guy who just comes in and plays defense and just gives you stability, and that's what's really valuable in the NBA, right? We look at a guy like DaRon, right, who is flashy as all get out and can do all sorts of stuff, but he's not consistent, and therefore you're struggling a little bit. Where's in that mold where he needs time and he can't give you that contribution early, and you're looking for more contribution early at number 5. That's really what you want. You want more consistency from the player, even if they're pretty talented. I think right now he's in a tier in my board that's probably somewhere around like pick 14 to 20. So, if that's a trade back, it's probably because you got 2 picks, I think. Something like is it the Blazers that have 2 picks in that range? Otherwise, I'd say he's more of a trade into the back into the first, and you're looking at him because he's fallen into the 20s. That's probably more the speed.
All right, so to wrap up this segment, not the podcast, but this segment. So let me just the percentage chance. What's the percentage chance you think the Pistons could realistically consider him a viable option to trade at, whether, like I said, back into the first round or get a second pick in the first round? What do you think he realistically could be someone we see being on the Pistons radar, or do you think this is more so not in the Pistons ideas?
It's new GM, right? Hard to know what he values. I'm trying to think of the athletic big man that he's on the Lakers now. Is it that the Pelicans drafted Jackson Hayes? Yeah. So like that was another similar gamble on athleticism and tools, right? So maybe that's something that Trajan Langdon would be interested in. But that's really all you have to go on, right? The chance of anybody trading back in is relatively low, like 20%, right? It's not a thing that happens.
So let me change the question. Would you if you were the GM, do you value Ware enough for this team where he would be someone you consider trading back into the first round for?
Always depends on the price, but like if you're talking like trading into like pick 23, 25, something like that, and he's there, like sure.
But not mid-lottery, not like end of lottery or mid-first round.
I'm not trading for him at like 13. That's not why I'm making that trade. I'd better be getting something else before I'm just committing to that.
All right. So we'll wrap that one up there, and then we'll move on. In the next segment, we'll talk about Kyle Filipowski as another potential option for the Detroit Pistons as a stretch 5. We'll talk about that when we come back. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy that, in fact, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. That's so easy that 2.5 million small businesses are using LinkedIn for hiring. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button on the YouTube channel or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. We are on our way to 10,000 subscribers. We're about, a little over 1,000 away, but we're trying to get there before the end. My goal is to get there before the end of the next season. If we could get there before that, that would be great. But that's the goal right now. Probably should set the goal at like 9,000. I believe we're at 8.24 right now. I'm trying to rise up the ranks at Locked On NBA. I think we're about middle of the pack right now. We should be way higher. So if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button at the YouTube channel. I really would appreciate it. But Hal, let's move on to Kyle Filipowski. And I do want to, again, say the reason why I'm having this episode is because I truly think that if Asar Thompson and Cade are like your cornerstones, if Asar is someone you really have highly, I personally think that a stretch 5 is something you seriously need to consider, because I'm not completely convinced that you can get away with having 2 non-shooters on the floor. And at the time of the pre-draft, before Asar's draft, I had more belief in him becoming an outside shooter eventually. I do not have that same level of belief. I don't think it's impossible, but I'm not as confident in that happening. And just because of how good, I know small sample, but just because of how good it looked with Gallinari and Muscala, not only is it a small sample, it also just follows like logically for me. Like, hey, if you have a guy who can space the floor at 5, would it work? Yeah, it sounds like it would work. Let's see what it looks like. Oh, it looked great. Okay, makes sense. Like that's what it says to me. So I think it's something they really need to consider. Now, obviously, not everyone can just go get a stretch 5. If it was that easy, the Pistons obviously would rather have someone who could shoot at 5, but it's hard to come by those guys. But that's why we're having this episode. But Hal, go on about Kyle Filipowski. Is he, well, I guess the first thing I want to ask you, do you have him over Ware, or is he in the same range? Is he below? Where do you have him compared to Ware?
I have Filipowski slightly above Ware on my boards.
Okay, so tell us why you have him higher than Kel'el.
So he's kind of the opposite of where Ware is all tools and then like flashes of different skills. Filipowski's pretty consistent, but he doesn't have the burst athleticism that Ware does. So again, this is a true 7-footer. A little under, but pretty close. I mean, he's a legit 5. And Filipowski also has the shot. He shot a lot more. He's got a more of a background in shooting. He shot about 35% this year. But Filipowski is more Olynyk-y in his skill set. Like he's much more of the high post passer, the dribble handoff guy. Ware is not like a clever screen setter. Filipowski is. Like Filipowski very much is an angles and manipulation guy. And he's maybe like someone you'd consider a slightly lower ceiling player just because he doesn't have the freak athleticism tools. And certainly like defensively. He's a little better than he probably gets credit for. He's a sneaky defender where, his positioning's pretty good. He moves his feet better than you'd probably expect for, kind of a bulky looking white guy. But like, he's not going to be a lockdown defender. You're going to want to build, some length around him, just let him kind of be in a drop for the most part. But he does have some pretty good vertical tools. And like, as long as he's in a relatively safe system, which is not something the Pistons can necessarily guarantee him, but as long as he's in a relatively stable position, I think Filipowski will do okay there. And then just kind of on offense, he's the guy where you can run your offense through him. He can run 2-man game stuff. He can pick and pop. He's got his own kind of face-up game that's really fun. So he's just a much more stable and consistent and versatile offensive player, and who you hope can survive on defense. And I think he's got enough tools to do that in the right context.
All right, so it sounds like this is a player that you expect to be an immediate shooter out the gate. It's not someone you're waiting on. Do you expect him to be an immediate stretch 5?
Yeah, he hasn't yet wowed us with the percentages, but he's got a pretty good baseline going back to high school of taking them and making enough. And then because he's a guy who can, give you the DHO offense and stuff, you don't feel bad about throwing it to him on the pop because he can immediately flip around and execute something else, right? He can, if it's not open, or if he catches and his feet aren't set, like Isaiah Stewart, for example, one of the next steps for him as a shooter is when his shot prep wasn't great, he can freeze a little bit and he's not really a great DHO operator and stuff. Filipowski has no problem putting the ball on the floor, dribbling to the other side of the floor, executing a DHO, starting a two-man game, and because of that, I'm pretty confident that he's going to be allowed to, to take shots and to kind of stay within the flow. You're not that worried about keeping him involved in the offense.
So what is outside of athleticism? What's holding his ceiling from being necessarily very high? It sounds like that he's a low ceiling player. Outside, is it just athleticism, or what is it that's holding him from being one of these high ceiling players?
It's pretty much the athleticism. He's not a freaky wingspan guy. He just doesn't have crazy tools. He did have to have surgery going from. He's another sophomore, by the way. He had to have surgery going from his freshman to his sophomore year on his hips. They actually lengthened his hip muscles to try and help give him some more flexibility. He was in a lot of pain, I guess, before that. I thought it did look significantly better, which is not normally a thing you say about people who have hip surgery, right? Usually that's a bad sign. But it did look pretty good, and hopefully, as that continues, he's gonna get a little more comfortable as an athlete. But it is, he has got a pretty tough ceiling there athletically, and that's like Filipowski is a guy you draft, to kind of probably preempt a question you're about to ask me. He's not a guy you're going to draft at 5, right? And he's a guy you're probably going to trade back into, around that or trade back for, or trade back into starting at like the 15 to 25 range, somewhere in there. Because you're hoping he'll be your bench pick. Like, I don't really think you're drafting Filipowski with this intent that he's going to start right away. If he does, that's probably a pretty bad sign for Jalen DaRon.
So is he a player? So since you said you already answered that question, would you trade back into the first round? Is he a player you feel like the Pistons, if you were the GM of the Pistons, if you were the president of basketball operations, is he someone you would consider trading back into the first round for?
Maybe, yeah. It's all so price dependent. I mean, I struggle to know what the asset is that you're giving up in that trade, right? But the average value trade for a 15 to 20 pick, I'm probably fine with that. But like for the Pistons, that asset is like Isaiah Stewart. That kind of thing is usually the price, and I don't want to. You already have that asset. I don't know why you'd do that. So that's the only tricky part of it.
All right, fair enough. So I don't know if I want to wrap it up on Filipowski and then move on to Holmes right now, and then in the last segment we can talk about Clingan. Do you want to spend more time on Holmes, or do you think we can knock him out in the next 3 or 4 minutes?
I think we could knock Holmes out quick.
Okay, so DaRon Holmes, do you have him? Where do you have him between Ware and Filipowski? Is he above both of them? Is he below? Is he in between? Where do you have him on your board?
Right in that same range. We're still talking in that 14 to 25, 15 to 25 range for me. So right in the same spot.
All right, why should Pistons fans like him?
He is very Christian Woody without maybe some of the character issues that have driven people crazy over Christian Wood. Like, he is pretty athletic, like a great first step. He does a bunch of stuff like off the dribble, and he just has like a very creative offensive game. There's a little bit of like the Daniel Gafford flexibility, where like Gafford will like lean all the way around, like scoop shots and stuff like that when he's finishing in the post. Holmes is like that. He can shoot, he can dribble. The thing about Holmes, and he's a athletic defender whose positioning can get a little better. He's pretty skinny. He can get kind of bullied a little bit, like on rebounds. You can like dig him out of his position stuff. And the big thing for him is he's not an amazing playmaker considering the usage he had in college. Like, he was given every touch he wanted, and was allowed to like do whatever he wanted, and it was pretty productive. But it wasn't like I would say Filipowski is clearly a better passer for me. And really, it's just a question again for him of like decision making and what does it look like. I don't know that he's a starting center in my book. Friend of the podcast, Bryce Simon, loves DaRon Holmes. He's a big fan. And so he's another guy where like if he's your backup center, I'm pretty happy. I don't know that he's got starter potential for me, but he's a guy you can throw in there and give you the like Bobby Portis energy kind of thing, where he just gives you a lot of utility all over the floor.
Okay, so to wrap up this whole idea of the stretch five, I want to ask you, Hal. So I think you follow me on Twitter, obviously, so you know how I feel about this stuff. Do you feel and then we'll wrap up the podcast. Or why do I keep saying the podcast? We'll wrap up this segment. My goodness.
He's trying to kick me out early.
Right. Do you feel similar as me as that a stretch 5 could be or should be some of the Pistons to be looking at if they want to keep on with Asar potentially starting next to Cade? And do you feel strongly enough, as I do, about this, where it's something that you're like, okay, we should try to get back into the first round to get one of these stretch 5s because we need one of these? Or is it something, or do you not feel as strongly about it? Just where is your stance on, because I think this is a conversation that at least I've been told, and I think James has said it on the podcast with me, and Amari said it on the podcast. I don't feel like I'm leaking anything, but like this is, if I am, oops. but like a conversation they're going to be having.
Sure.
Where do you stand on it?
I think every team should have the option to go to that, right? Like you should have the ability to put a shooter at a 5. I don't know necessarily that I agree that it's a priority just because I like Isaiah Stewart at the 5. And I think that like Isaiah Stewart right now, I'm not super comfortable in his shooting as a 4 because you're asked to do a lot of like movement and repositioning as a 4 when you shoot. And that's something he struggles with. And hopefully this summer it's something he gets better with. He's gotten better every year. So maybe he comes back and he's able to do that stuff. As a 5, it's like just pick and pop, right? You're involved in the action, just pick and pop. So I think you have already a player on the roster who can give you that as a alternative. Give you that as a starter, that's where it's like I don't know that he's going to be your starting center. Maybe I it's hard to say that DaRon has necessarily earned the right to start guaranteed over Isaiah Stewart like that. To me, it's like, do I want that or do I want to draft a pick and pop spacing 5 or do I want more wings? The answer for me is almost always going to be more wings. Like it's because I have Stu. In order to fill the role, I'd probably take that. But if you're not confident that Stu can do it, you need to find other options because I think you need that option, whether it's for Asar, whether it's just to give Cade, even if it's a maximum spacing 5-out lineup, right? You want to have that kind of option to go to just tactically, whether or not Asar is playing.
All right, fair enough. When we come back, we'll talk about Donovan Clingan because this is a player I know a lot of you guys want to hear about. We've talked about him on the last 2 draft episodes where we've had guests on. He's come up, and a lot of you guys go to the comments. A lot of you guys go to my DMs, still asking about Clingan, saying you guys love Clingan. So I want to get Hal's thoughts on Clingan. And then there's another topic I want to ask him about real quick. I haven't told him about yet before we wrap up the podcast.
Oh, boy.
We'll see how it goes. But stay tuned for all that when we come back. PrizePicks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 5 million members. It is the most fun and exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. You just pick more or less on 2 or more player stat projections for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. With PrizePicks, you can turn out $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. You can make PrizePick lineups in as little as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you are locked in. If you're looking for promotions, PrizePicks has got you covered every single week. From lowering select player stats projections on Tuesdays, which increases your chances of getting a win, to getting your entry fees back if you have a losing lineup on Fridays. And for June, make sure to try out esports this month because every Wednesday and Saturday in June, again, in June only, if your lineup doesn't win, you'll get your entry fee back. Choose from Counter-Strike 2, Call of Duty, League of Legends, and more. And one of the reasons why I absolutely love PrizePicks is they have an injury insurance policy. A player gets hurt in the first half of a game, doesn't return the second. Other places you might be screwed over, but with PrizePicks, that guy or girl is automatically rebooted for you. I absolutely love it. It's such a lifesaver with PrizePicks is why I absolutely love it. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy with PrizePicks. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button at the YouTube channel or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. So Hal, it sounds like, now this is a guy that does sound like may not even be there at 5, and definitely if he is, will be in consideration as the pick for 5. And that's Donovan Clingan. So it sounds like I've said this on the podcast a few times in the last few weeks. So again, I've been kind of hinting at this for a minute. Wink, wink, elbow, elbow, nudge, nudge. But it feels like to me that one of the things that really, like, obviously the Pistons won 14 games last year. Obviously everything irked their nerves last year. Like, obviously. But it seems like one of the things that was at the very top of the list is the defense from their 5 position. The rim protection, the lack of rim protection, the lack of defensive effort, just the defense from their 5 position seems to have really bothered them a ton, which is why you hear them linked to a Claxton, why you hear them linked to a Hartenstein. And now a lot of people are talking about Clingan. So first, before we even talk about, I get your thoughts on Clingan, the player, do you agree that he should be someone the Pistons, if he's there at 5, should he be in play as the pick there?
Well, you should be like ecstatic if he's at 5, because whether you want him or not, a whole bunch of people want him. So like, if somebody is going to trade up for the Pistons pick, the most value you're probably going to get is because because Clingan is there. So that alone would make me very excited to see him slide to 5, because that means that other things are in play. Certainly, I think he's a value to the Pistons. I've said before, I like DaRon. I like what DaRon could become, but like, those players are projects. They take time. And in the meantime, you need somebody else to help your kids grow. It's really hard to evaluate whether Jaden Ivey is doing the right thing if Jalen Duren isn't behind him, giving him the right communication, right? Like, having the 5 is having a quarterback of the defense. It's not just about that player's ability to do kind of their own positional defense. It's about their ability to quarterback everything else around them. And the minute that breaks down, you have all the other breakdowns. And the Pistons had a ton of kind of waterfall effects from Duren not being ready for the role he was given yet. And that's not really Duren's fault. Like, you can't expect too much of most young bigs, but it also means it's very hard to evaluate everyone else because you have that. So, Clingan is a guy who comes in pretty ready-made defensively, and it's pretty rare for me to say, like, you should go get him over a veteran big, right? Like, do you get Clingan, or do you go get a Claxton or a Hartenstein or somebody to fill that role? But he's played in an NBA style defense for years. He's really good in that defense. He is a good communicator. He's pretty smart in defense. Like, I think, yeah, he absolutely can bring you positive minutes, fill in the gaps, and compete with Duren, and maybe even replace Duren if people decide that's necessary. Certainly, I think there's still people who would give you trade value that's pretty high for Jalen Duren, and so maybe you just decide that's the way to go. But I think if he's there at 5, Donovan Clingan just gives you a ton of options that pretty much no other player being there gives you when it comes to you can trade pretty much anyone and make any decision you want, because he gives you he's such a known commodity, right? You know what you're getting out of Donovan Clingan.
So I take it as, would I be correct in saying you are pretty high on Clingan?
It's not just high, like, I know what he is, and that's so rare for a prospect. I know that Donovan Clingan is going to come in, he's going to protect the rim, and he's going to do the basics on offense in terms of like finishing on the roll. He can make the high post passes, hit some cutters. Like, I know what I can do with him, and like, he's a limited defender. He's not going to switch or anything, but like, I know exactly what scheme I'm going to run. Like, that consistency and that understanding of what role he provides is something that, like, the Pistons certainly don't have that at basically any position other than Cade, right? I mean, someone like Fontecchio, right? You know who he is. But for the most part, like, even someone like Quentin Grimes, right? Because of his health situation, you're not entirely sure what you can get out of Quentin Grimes. So to have players where you know what they are, you know what their strengths are, you know what their weaknesses are, you know how to, what should be done to build around them, that has a lot of value.
No, I think that is an incredible point. The idea of the Pistons having, like, and like you said, knowing that if you were to draft Clingan and you know exactly what defensive scheme you're going to have, you know what your defensive, you know what you're going to be doing, that, and it kind of builds an identity and you know what to build towards. That's something that I feel like I've been very critical about this on the podcast for months. That the Pistons I felt like the Pistons have not had a true one vision from top down. It feels like there's been a bunch of different, it doesn't feel like everyone was ever on the same page about what they wanted to build towards or what this team they're trying to build towards and be. So having that, like you said, that kind of consistency and just known that, hey, this is what we're trying to be. This is what we're going to be building towards. This is what, this is what we're going to be doing. I do think that would really help a lot of people on the roster, whoever's on the roster, whether it's the young guys or whether they get just knowing what you're trying to be and what you're building around and what you're going to be doing. I think that would really help a lot of them. A lot of the players that are currently on the Pistons right now.
Well, the nice thing is you have Isaiah Stewart to give you the other option, right? If you're like, we're playing Clingan and something goes wrong and the drop big isn't working today, you have the opposite option, in the switch big who can space the floor and do that kind of stuff. Like you would have, the ability to toggle between styles a little bit, which is a major advantage when you have, because Stewart is very consistent himself, right? You know what you're getting out of him, especially defensively. So between the two, you would have a lot of understanding of where you need to go from the big man position.
So, and this is the topic I wanted to ask you before we left and kind of surprise you with. So this is a take that I've had for all summer and the last few months. And I'm not saying I'm completely jumping off this, but if I had to move one of the young guys, I would be moving Jaden Ivey. That's something that's where I've planted my flag. I'm not as high on Jaden Ivey as everyone else. I'm not as big of a believer as everyone else in the Ivy Cade backcourt. So I have been, if we're making moves to try and improve the team, you move Jaden Ivey. However, now with the talk of, with everything going on about the big man situation and knowing really, and I think this happened when we had James in the podcast like a week and a half ago. I really sat back and thought about it after we talked with him. I was like, wait, I don't know about that anymore, because if you get Claxton or you get Hartenstein or you get a Clingan, he falls to 5, you get Clingan. If you get him, those three options are probably starting. There's a chance Clingan isn't starting. I'd assume he is. I know for a fact Hartenstein or Claxton are starting. If you're bringing him to Detroit, they are your starting 5s. If that's the case, I think you agree. I can't say 99%, but I'm pretty sure you agree with this. Stu is a backup 5. I do not want to see him at the 4. I think he is a backup 5 in the NBA, a valuable one. I think he started to kind of understand that. I think the team kind of started to understand that. And I think that's why you started to see him get better and better and better. He started to be used correctly. If he's your backup, if you know that, the one player that you have drafted that actually has gotten better every year and you've actually signed to a rookie extension, you should be valuing him. And his best value, you're getting the best value out of him and his contract and him as a player as a backup 5. Well, if that's what you're doing, where's DaRon? Like, what's the point in, like, I'm finding it hard to, it's just a numbers game at that point. Not even about whether I'm higher on DaRon or Ivy. It says, okay, if you're going to get a center for the defensive concerns, which I completely get, DaRon was terrible defensively. Like, I completely understand it. If you do that, I would want Stu to be the backup 5. I think most people would. Where's DaRon? So what do you think about that whole situation? Do you think DaRon's the odd man out? Would you be shocked to see him get moved?
I think certainly he's the odd man out. I mean, it's like, first of all, it depends on what you're doing to convince those guys to sign, right? Like if you're offering Hartenstein or Claxton, like their equivalent of like the Bruce Brown deal, right? Like we're just going to give you a ton of money up front, maybe even a player option so you can get out of this as soon as you want. We just want you for next year. Just bridge this gap until DaRon is ready. They probably come in, they start, but like DaRon, at least then you can look to him and be like, hey, all you got to do is get better, right? Like there's the starting spot's going to open back up for you immediately. Maybe that works. If you're going to give those guys years, you can't also then tell DaRon like, hey, we've got this prime role for you, this starring role. Like someone like Claxton and Hartenstein, they're not going back to the bench. It's not, one of them is getting traded, and sometimes you can get away with that on like a wing position because there's enough minutes to go around. the center is a singular position, right? You only get one on the floor at a time, especially for the true centers. So yeah, I think he's the odd man out. I also think he probably right now carries more value, or how do I say this? I think if you were to trade Ivy right now, I think that you are getting about as low a value as you can get for Ivy. Like if he continues to be exactly what he is right now and just doesn't improve, I don't think his trade value dips much lower. Because like next year he'll just be a 1-year trial player. Like that has its own value. If for whatever reason he re-signs here and he's on year 5 and he's still struggling, like he's not going to re-sign for big money. So I don't know that Ivy's value is going to dip much lower where you're going to be like, we should have traded him, we should have traded him in 2023. This is such a big problem. Whereas I think Ivy's value can absolutely skyrocket, right? DaRon, we saw this with Andre Drummond, where like DaRon could be productive. And if he's not that guy on defense, the trade value for that doesn't really spike. So I think the FOMO, right? That fear of missing out, that opportunity cost. If you move DaRon and he blows up, I don't think you feel as bad about if you moved Ivy and it turns out that all Ivy needed was a change of scenery, right? If Ivy turns around and by 2027 he's getting an all-star bid, you're going to feel awful because you definitely lost a ton of value there. So yeah, I think it all kind of points to if you have to move someone, you should move DaRon first. And you got to hope that this year you can put Ivy in a better position to succeed. And all he has to do is get a little bit better for him to for people to believe in Ivy. I still talk to people on a regular basis who would say that Jaden Ivey, the prospect, they would put him number 1 in this draft, and they'd still consider like a top 15 pick from this draft in trade value for Ivy, which I think a lot of people have given up on him further than that in Detroit, but I think there's still a lot of faith in the league that he can be, much better than this.
And to wrap up the podcast, the opportunity cost, again, I've talked about it a ton on this podcast. It's probably my main argument for trading one of Ivy or DaRon. It's been my main argument all offseason. And it's something that's been brought up in James articles over the last few weeks. Not for a mistake. It's not an accident. It's a conversation that will be had in the front office about, and it should be. It doesn't mean I'm not saying where I know where I would end up on, but they don't have to. I'm not saying they would be wrong to end up on either end. It's just a conversation that absolutely needs to be had. You need to be talking about that because this offseason is going to be so important, and you don't want to mess up with that.
Well, there's a timeline, right? You go one more year, and then money starts being a real factor in this. So the decision has to be made this year, whether it's this offseason right now or this trade deadline. You're making it this year.
Right. I completely agree. I'm interested to see where they go with this. So, but thank you, Hal, for coming on, man, and talking about this. I might try to get you on again before the draft to talk about somebody. We'll see though if we can squeeze.
Why does this always sound like a trap? It always sounds like a trap.
It's not a trap. It's always a good time. It's always a good time. So
always a blast.
I appreciate you, Hal. You guys can follow him on Twitter @HalBritius. Great draft takes. Obviously, great Piston stuff as well. Follow him over there. I appreciate you guys making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. Hit that subscribe button to the YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review, whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Stay safe out there. Till next time, peace out.